Marcus Wilson stood frozen at the back of St. Peter's Church, his hand trembling on Ranger's leash as the black Labrador's desperate barks echoed through the somber gathering. The mourners turned in unison, faces shifting from grief to confusion, to anger. But Ranger wouldn't stop, lunging toward the polished mahogany coffin at the front of the church, his usually gentle eyes wild with determination. No one could have guessed that in just moments Father Thomas would approach that coffin, peer inside, and discover a truth that would turn his face ghostly white. A truth that would transform a day of mourning into something no one in the small town of Millfield would ever forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rain pattered against the stained glass windows of St. Peter's Church, casting multicolored shadows across the gathered mourners. Marcus Wilson, a former search and rescue coordinator, stood at the rear of the church, his 6-year-old black Labrador Ranger sitting dutifully at his feet. The dog's ears were perked, his posture unusually rigid as he scanned the room with intelligent brown eyes. "He'll be quiet during the service, won't he?" whispered Rebecca, Marcus's sister, her voice tight with worry as she adjusted her black dress. Mom would be horrified if anything disrupted Richard's funeral. Marcus nodded, giving Ranger a reassuring pat. He's been through dozens of memorial services for the team. He knows how to behave. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus felt a flicker of unease. Over the past 3 days, since his stepfather Richard's body had been discovered in his study, apparent heart attack, the coroner had said, Ranger had been acting strangely. The normally sociable lab had refused to enter Richard's study, whining at the doorway. He'd paced the house at night, something he hadn't done since his rescue training days. And most troubling, he'd actually growled, when the funeral director had arrived to discuss arrangements. "I should have left him at home," Marcus murmured, but the truth was he couldn't bring himself to do it. After 15 years as a canine search and rescue handler in the Rocky Mountains, Ranger was more than a pet. He was Marcus's lifeline. When a devastating avalanche 3 years ago had buried 4 of his team members and left Marcus with a permanent limp and countless surgeries, it was Ranger who had found him beneath 6 feet of snow, Ranger who had stayed by his hospital bed during recovery, and Ranger who had given him purpose when he'd been forced into early retirement. The organist began playing the opening notes of Amazing Grace, signaling the beginning of the service. Richard Harrington, Marcus's stepfather of 20 years, had been a pillar of the Millfield community, successful attorney, church elder, generous donor to local charities. The packed church testified to his standing, with nearly 200 people crowded into the pews. Marcus's mother, Eleanor, sat in the front row, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Despite the complicated relationship Marcus had with his stepfather, the man had never fully accepted him, always holding him at arm's length. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy for his mother. She had truly loved Richard, had built a life with him after Marcus's father died when he was just 10 years old. Father Thomas approached the pulpit, his aging face solemn as he opened his prayer book. "We gather today to celebrate the life of Richard James Harrington, beloved husband, father, and friend." At that moment, Ranger's body tensed. A low whine escaped his throat. "Shh," Marcus whispered, gently touching the dog's head. But instead of settling as he typically would, Ranger's whine grew louder. His eyes were fixed not on Marcus but on the closed coffin at the front of the church. Rebecca shot Marcus a warning glance. Several mourners turned in their seats, disapproving looks on their faces. Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck as he tightened his grip on Ranger's leash. "Sorry," he whispered, attempting to guide Ranger toward the exit, but the black lab planted his feet firmly, refusing to budge. His whine transformed into a single sharp bark that sliced through Father Thomas's prayer like a knife. "Marcus!" Rebecca hissed, mortification evident in her eyes. But something in Ranger's posture stopped Marcus from dragging him outside. He'd seen this behavior before, not the social disruption, but the focused intensity. This was Ranger's working posture, the same rigid stance he adopted when he'd found someone beneath the snow or tracked a lost hiker through miles of wilderness. Father Thomas paused, glancing toward the disruption with a mixture of patience and reproof. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "your dog might be more comfortable outside." Marcus nodded, embarrassed, and tried again to lead Ranger toward the door. The lab responded by barking more urgently, straining against his leash not toward the exit, but toward the coffin. "I'm so sorry," Marcus stammered, fighting to control his normally impeccably trained companion. But Ranger's behavior only escalated, with strength born of years finding people in disaster situations. He pulled forward, dragging Marcus down the side aisle toward the front of the church. The funeral service ground to a halt. Eleanor raised her head, confusion and anger warring on her tear-streaked face. "Marcus, please," she begged, her voice breaking. Shame flooded through him. He'd disappointed her again, just as he had by choosing a dangerous career instead of joining Richard's law firm, by moving away to the mountains instead of staying in Millfield, by missing holidays and family gatherings when rescues called him away. Even now, with Richard gone, he was disrupting the one thing she'd asked of him, to help give her husband a dignified farewell. But Ranger wouldn't be deterred. With another powerful lunge, he broke free from Marcus's grip and bounded down the aisle, skidding to a stop beside the coffin. The lab's barks transformed into a continuous, urgent sound that Marcus recognized from countless rescues. The alert that meant Ranger had found something critical, something that demanded immediate attention. The church erupted in shocked murmurs. Eleanor covered her face with her hands. Rebecca rushed forward, trying to grab Ranger's collar, but the dog dodged her, circling the coffin and pawing at its polished side. "Marcus, control that animal immediately," Richard's brother William demanded, his face flushed with anger. Father Thomas raised his hands, attempting to restore order, but Ranger's barking only grew more frantic, more insistent. The dog jumped up, placing his front paws on the edge of the coffin, his meaning unmistakable. A strange calm settled over Marcus as he limped down the aisle toward his dog. Through the chaos and embarrassment, a certainty took hold. Ranger wasn't misbehaving. The lab was trying to communicate something vital, just as he had countless times in the mountains. "Father," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the uproar, "I think you need to check the coffin." The priest stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Wilson, surely you don't suggest—" "Please!" Marcus insisted, reaching Ranger's side and placing a steadying hand on the dog's back. "My dog was trained to find people in need of rescue. Something's wrong. He knows something we don't." The absurdity of the request wasn't lost on anyone. The funeral director stepped forward, outrage evident in his professional demeanor. "This is highly inappropriate. The casket was prepared according to the family's wishes and has remained sealed since yesterday. But Ranger continued his alert, his barks interspersed with the high-pitched whine that Marcus knew meant urgency, the sound he made when minutes mattered, when lives hung in the balance. "Father Thomas," Marcus said, meeting the priest's eyes, "I've trusted this dog with my life more times than I can count. He's found people buried under avalanches when our equipment couldn't detect them. He's tracked hikers through impossible terrain. If he's trying to tell us something about that coffin, there's a reason." A heavy silence fell over the church. Father Thomas looked toward Eleanor, silently seeking permission. After a long moment, she gave a small, bewildered nod. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Very well," the priest said, his voice betraying his skepticism. He approached the coffin, cautiously, as if expecting Ranger to lunge at him. But the lab backed away, watching intently as Father Thomas reached for the lid. Marcus held his breath as the priest carefully opened the coffin, just enough to peek inside. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Father Thomas's face drained of all color. He staggered back, crossing himself reflexively. "Call an ambulance," he gasped. "Immediately." The funeral director rushed forward, looking into the coffin himself, his professional composure shattered. "My God," he whispered. "He's breathing." The church erupted in chaos. Marcus pushed forward, ignoring the pain shooting through his damaged leg. He reached the coffin and stared down in disbelief. There lay Richard, his skin ashen, but his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "He's alive," Marcus whispered, as Ranger pressed against his leg. His barking finally ceased, now that the humans had understood his message. Someone was already on the phone with emergency services. Others cleared the center aisle for paramedics. Marcus's mother had collapsed against Rebecca, sobbing words no one could understand. In the midst of the pandemonium, Marcus knelt beside Ranger, burying his face in the lab's thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "The best boy." The dog had done the impossible once again, just as he had found Marcus. Buried beneath the avalanche, just as he had located dozens of lost and injured souls in the wilderness, Ranger had sensed life where everyone else had seen only death. And in that moment, as the rain continued to drum against the stained-glass windows of St. Peter's Church, Marcus understood that some bonds transcend explanation. The connection between a handler and his dog, between life and death, between past mistakes and future redemptions. An hour later, Marcus sat in the hospital waiting room, Ranger lying at his feet. The emergency room doctors had confirmed what seemed impossible. Richard Harrington had been in a deep catatonic state, mimicking death so convincingly that the coroner had made a catastrophic error. A rare reaction to a new medication, they suspected, though tests were still being conducted. Eleanor sat across from Marcus, her eyes red-rimmed but now dry. "If it hadn't been for Ranger," she whispered, unable to finish the thought. Marcus nodded, scratching behind the lab's ears. Ranger had refused to leave his side, as if understanding the magnitude of what had transpired. Rebecca returned with coffee for everyone, her hands still shaking slightly. "The doctor says if he'd remained in that state much longer without medical intervention." She trailed off, the implication hanging heavily in the air. "They're saying it's a miracle, Marcus." "Not a miracle," Marcus replied quietly. Just a dog doing what he was trained to do, find life. William approached cautiously, the anger from the church completely gone from his face. I owe you and your dog an apology, he said gruffly, extending his hand to Marcus. We all do. Unison. As Marcus shook his hand, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Through the waiting room window, he could see news vans pulling into the hospital parking lot. Word had spread quickly in the small town. The man who'd been declared dead, saved. At his own funeral by his stepson's dog. You're going to be on every news channel by tonight, Rebecca observed, following his gaze. Marcus grimaced. He'd never sought attention, had always preferred the solitude of the mountains to the spotlight. But as a nurse approached to inform them that Richard was stabilizing and would likely recover, he realized this story wasn't really about him at all. It was about Ranger, about the extraordinary capabilities of dogs that too often went unrecognized, about the countless lives they saved without recognition or reward. And perhaps it was about second chances too, not just for Richard, who had nearly been buried alive, but for all of them. As the doctor invited Eleanor and Rebecca to briefly visit Richard in the ICU, Marcus remained in the waiting room, his thoughts drifting back to the long, painful months after the avalanche. He remembered lying in his hospital bed, certain his life was over, that he'd never walk properly again, never return to the work that defined him. It was Ranger who had given him purpose during those dark days. Ranger who had reminded him daily that adaptation wasn't the same as defeat. His phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues in the search and rescue community, all having heard the incredible news. One text in particular caught his eye, from his old team leader. Always said that dog was special. Maybe time to put those talents back to work. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, something stirring inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. His mother returned to the waiting room, looking exhausted but relieved. He's conscious, she said wonderingly. Confused, but conscious. The doctors say there's no obvious brain damage from the oxygen deprivation. She sank into the chair beside Marcus, reaching out to stroke Ranger's head. I never really understood before today what you did in those mountains, what this dog means to you. He saved my life once too, Marcus said quietly. After the avalanche, they almost didn't find me in time. Eleanor's eyes widened. You never told me that. There was a lot I didn't tell you, Marcus admitted, about the accident, about the recovery. It was easier to stay away than to feel like a disappointment. Eleanor's face softened with regret. Richard and we were wrong to pressure you to follow his path. We just worried about you, especially after we lost your father. She looked down at Ranger, who had placed his head on her knee, watching her with soulful eyes. All those years, I thought your work was taking you away from your family. I never realized you'd found another kind of family out there. Before Marcus could respond, the hospital waiting room doors burst open. A disheveled man in his 30s rushed in, his eyes scanning the room frantically until they landed on Marcus and Ranger. He hurried over, hope and desperation written across his face. "Are you Marcus Wilson, with the rescue lab?" the man asked, breathlessly. "The nurse said I might find you here." Marcus nodded, puzzled. "My name's David Corman. My daughter Sophie, she's 7. The man's voice broke. "We were hiking on Ridgeline Trail this morning. She was right behind me and then she wasn't. I've been searching for hours. The rangers are out there now, but the fog's rolling in and there's a storm coming." Understanding dawned. Marcus had hiked Ridgeline hundreds of times during his years with search and rescue. It was treacherous in good weather. With fog and an approaching storm, it would become nearly impossible to navigate. "I heard what your dog did at the church," David continued desperately. "They said he can find people when no one else can. Please, I don't know who else to ask." Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the waiting room. His mother, his sister, the hospital staff, who had overheard the conversation. For 3 years, he'd told himself his rescue days were behind him, that his injury had closed that chapter of his life. But as he looked down at Ranger, alert and ready beside him, Marcus knew there had never really been a choice. This was who they were, not separately but together, a team forged in snow and struggle, in life and near death. "Where exactly did you last see her?" Marcus asked, already reaching for Ranger's leash. 3 hours later, as thunder rumbled overhead and fog shrouded the dense forest of Ridgeline Trail, Marcus navigated the familiar terrain despite his aching leg. Ranger moved ahead, nose to the ground, working the scent cone with practiced precision. Behind them, David struggled to keep pace, hope and fear warring on his face. "The local team's working the southern ridge," Marcus explained, checking the GPS coordinates on his phone. "We'll take the northern approach. The terrain's rougher, but if she wandered off the main trail, this is the most likely direction." The forest grew denser as they climbed, the mist wrapping around the tall pines like ghostly fingers. Rain began to fall, first as a gentle patter on the leaves overhead, then more insistently. Marcus knew they were racing against time, not just because of the approaching storm, but because a 7-year-old lost in these mountains had limited survivability, especially as temperatures would drop with nightfall. "Sophie!" David called, his voice cracking with desperation. "Sophie, can you hear me?" Only the intensifying rainfall answered. Marcus watched Ranger carefully, reading the subtle changes in the dog's body language. The lab was working diligently, but so far he hadn't hit on anything promising. As they pushed deeper into the forest, Marcus fought against his own doubts. His leg throbbed, reminding him why he'd left this work behind. The rational part of him knew the chances of finding the little girl diminished with each passing hour. But then he thought of Richard, declared dead by professionals, yet breathing in that coffin. He thought of himself, buried under tons of snow, found only because a black lab refused to give up the search, even after the human rescuers had begun to lose hope. "We'll find her," Marcus told David with quiet certainty. "Ranger hasn't failed yet." They pressed on as afternoon faded toward evening, the forest growing darker beneath the storm clouds. Marcus switched on his headlamp, the beam cutting through the mist and rain. They had covered nearly 4 miles of difficult terrain, far beyond where a child should have been able to wander. Just as Marcus was about to suggest they regroup with the main search team, Ranger's demeanor changed. His tail, which had been low and working steadily, suddenly lifted. His pace quickened as he angled sharply to the left, away from the faint trail they'd been following. "He's got something," Marcus said, his heart rate accelerating. He unclipped Ranger's long line, giving the dog freedom to work. "Ranger, seek!" The lab bounded forward, disappearing into the fog before reappearing, doubling back to make sure they were following, then plunging ahead again. This was the dance Marcus knew so well. Ranger had caught a human scent and was tracking it to its source. David stumbled forward, calling his daughter's name with renewed urgency. Marcus followed more carefully, his experienced eye scanning for hazards in the treacherous terrain. They were approaching a rocky outcropping, the ground falling away steeply on one side. Ranger's alert bark cut through the sound of rainfall. The distinctive three-bark pattern that meant he'd found what he was searching for. Marcus and David scrambled toward the sound, fighting through dense underbrush until they emerged at the edge of a small ravine. There, huddled beneath an overhanging rock, was a small figure in a bright yellow raincoat. Sophie Corman looked up at the sound of Ranger's bark, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but very much alive. "Daddy!" Her voice was small and frightened, but the relief in it was palpable. "Sophie!" David half climbed, half slid down the embankment, gathering his daughter into his arms with a sob. "Are you hurt? How did you get down here?" "I was chasing a butterfly," she explained, shivering against him. "Then I fell and couldn't get back up. I tried to yell, but nobody heard me." Marcus carefully made his way down to them, assessing the girl with a practiced eye. She was cold and frightened, but appeared uninjured except for some minor scrapes. As he knelt beside them, Ranger pushed forward, nuzzling the child gently. Sophie's eyes widened. "Is this the hero dog everyone talks about, the one that finds lost people?" Marcus smiled. "This is Ranger," he confirmed, "and yes, finding people is his specialty." As David radioed their coordinates to the main search team, Sophie reached out a small hand to pat Ranger's head. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a piece of himself that had been frozen since the avalanche suddenly thawing. The familiar rush of a successful rescue flooded through him, not just relief, but purpose, completion. Later that night, after Sophie had been checked by doctors and cleared to go home, Marcus sat in the hospital cafeteria with Ranger stretched out at his feet. The lab was exhausted but content, occasionally accepting gentle pats from passing staff who had heard about the double rescue he'd performed in a single day. Eleanor and Rebecca joined him, bringing coffee and sandwiches. "Richard's doctors say he's stabilizing," Eleanor reported, settling into a chair across from Marcus. "They're talking about a full recovery, given time." "That's amazing news," Marcus said sincerely. "Almost as amazing as what you and Ranger did today," Rebecca added, glancing toward the TV in the corner of the cafeteria, which was playing footage of Sophie's reunion with her mother at the hospital entrance. "Twice in one day. It's like something out of a movie." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "We just did what we're trained to do." "No," Eleanor said quietly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You did what you were meant to do. All these years, I thought." She paused, gathering herself. "I thought your work in search and rescue was just a way to avoid settling down, taking a sensible job like Richard wanted for you. I never understood that it wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about answering a calling." A lump formed in Marcus's throat. For 20 years, he'd carried the weight of his stepfather's disapproval, his mother's quiet disappointment. To hear her acknowledge his path now felt like the closing of a wound he'd stopped noticing because it had been with him so long. "I've been thinking," he said hesitantly, "about getting back into it. Not full-time field work, my leg won't handle that anymore, but training. Consultation. There's a program starting up in Millfield, actually, to train service dogs for veterans with PTSD. "Here?" Rebecca asked, surprised. "You'd stay in Millfield?" Marcus nodded, his hand dropping to stroke Ranger's. Fur. "It feels right," he said simply, "especially now." He didn't need to elaborate. They all understood the now encompassed everything. Richard's second chance at life, the rescued child, the reconciliation with his family, and the renewed sense of purpose Ranger had helped him rediscover. As they sat together in the quiet hospital cafeteria, Marcus realized that coming home hadn't meant giving up his identity after all. Instead, it had revealed a new path forward, one where his past and future could finally align. 2 months later, under the bright September sun, Marcus stood in the newly renovated barn behind his mother's property. The spacious structure had been transformed into a state-of-the-art training facility, with obstacle courses, scent training stations, and comfortable resting areas for both dogs and handlers. Ranger moved confidently through the space, demonstrating a complex search pattern for the 5 handlers and their dogs, watching attentively. At Marcus's whistle, the lab returned to his side, sitting proudly as Marcus addressed the group. "The bond between handler and dog isn't just about commands and obedience," he explained. "It's about communication, trust, and recognizing that sometimes your dog knows things you don't. Your job isn't to control, it's to listen, to support, and to trust." From the back of the barn, David Corman raised his hand. After Sophie's rescue, he had been the first to volunteer for the new K9 training program, bringing along a young German shepherd with promising search abilities. "How did you know to trust Ranger at the funeral?" he asked, "when everyone else thought he was just misbehaving?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Because I'd seen him work enough to know the difference between disruption and determination. But more than that," he paused, scratching Ranger behind the ears, "I trusted him because he'd never given me reason not to, not even when my own judgment failed." After the training session ended, Marcus lingered in the barn, making notes for the next day's activities. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew his attention, and he looked up to see a familiar car pulling into the driveway. Richard Harrington, still moving slowly but steadily recovering, made his way toward the barn. Marcus tensed involuntarily. Despite his near-death experience, despite Ranger's role in saving him, Richard had maintained his distance during his recovery, communicating with Marcus only through Eleanor. The old patterns of awkwardness and strained politeness had seemed destined to continue, miracle or no miracle. "Richard," Marcus greeted him cautiously, stepping out to meet his stepfather. "Mum didn't mention you'd be stopping by." "She doesn't know," Richard replied, his voice carrying a new gravel to it, a souvenir of the intubation he'd required after his rescue. "I wanted to see this place for myself." Marcus gestured toward the converted barn. "It's still a work in progress." Ranger emerged from the barn, approaching Richard with none of the wariness he'd shown before the funeral incident. The lab nudged the older man's hand gently, tail wagging in greeting. Richard stroked the dog's head with an awkwardness that spoke of a man unaccustomed to pets. "My doctors tell me I was minutes away from—" He trailed off, unable to speak the reality aloud. "They said if I'd been buried, no machinery would have detected what your dog somehow sensed." "He's special," Marcus acknowledged. "Yes," Richard agreed, "but so is his training, so is his handler." He straightened, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. "I've spent 2 months thinking about what it means to be given a second chance, not just at life, but at things I got wrong the first time around." A painful hope flickered in Marcus's chest. too tender to examine directly, too important to dismiss. "I've made arrangements with my foundation," Richard continued formally. "A substantial grant for your program here, enough to fund operations. For 3 years, with options for renewal based on demonstrated outcomes." Marcus blinked in surprise. "That's incredibly generous, but—" "It's not generosity," Richard interrupted. "It's investment in something valuable, something I should have recognized long ago." He gestured toward where Ranger stood, watching them both carefully. "Your mother told me about the little girl on the mountain, about all the others. Over the years, lives saved because you followed your own path instead of the one I tried to push you toward." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of 2 decades of misunderstanding. "I was wrong, Marcus," Richard said finally, the admission clearly costing him considerable effort. "About your choices, about what constitutes a life well lived." He extended his hand. "I'd like to start again if you're willing." Marcus looked at the offered hand, then at Ranger, who wagged his tail as if giving his approval. With a small smile, he reached out and clasped his stepfather's hand. "I think we know something about second chances around here," he said. As they walked together through the training facility, Richard asking questions and Marcus explaining the program's goals, neither of them spoke about the years lost to stubborn pride and mutual disappointment. Some rifts couldn't be healed with a single conversation. Some damage required time and patience to mend. But as the afternoon sun slanted through the barn windows, painting golden rectangles across the training floor, where Ranger now demonstrated scent detection for his stepfathers, benefit, Marcus felt the future unfolding before him, unexpected, unplanned, but somehow right. The Millfield K9 Training Academy grew rapidly, far beyond Marcus's initial modest vision. Within a year, the program had expanded to include not just search and rescue dogs, but service animals for veterans, therapy dogs for hospitals, and a special youth program that paired at-risk teenagers with dogs in training. Richard, to everyone's surprise, became one of the program's most vocal advocates, speaking at fundraisers and community events about his own experience and the extraordinary capabilities of well-trained service animals. His legal expertise proved invaluable in establishing the Academy as a non-profit organization, securing its financial future beyond the initial grant. On the anniversary of the funeral that wasn't, Marcus stood at the edge of the Academy's new training field, watching dozens of handlers and dogs working together under the autumn sun. Beside him, Ranger, now sporting a few grey hairs around. His muzzle, but still keen-eyed and alert, surveyed his domain with dignified satisfaction. Eleanor joined them, slipping her arm through her son's. "Richard wanted me to remind you about the fundraising gala next weekend," she said. "Apparently the governor has confirmed his attendance." Marcus groaned good-naturedly. "The training demonstrations I can handle. The black-tie speeches are still not my favorite part of this job." His mother smiled, watching as a young woman with prosthetic legs worked with a golden retriever service dog, practicing balance exercises with growing confidence. "You've built something remarkable here," she said softly, "out of what could have been tragedy." "Not just me," Marcus corrected, looking down at Ranger. "It's always been a team effort." A commotion at the entrance to the training field drew their attention. Sophie Corman, now 8 years old and a frequent visitor to the academy, came running toward them, her father following more sedately behind. "Marcus! Ranger!" Sophie called excitedly, skidding to a stop and presenting Ranger with a carefully crafted paper medal. "I made this for the anniversary. Mom helped me write the words." Marcus knelt down, helping Sophie attach the handmade decoration to Ranger's collar. The paper medallion bore the words, "Harry-O Dog," in a child's careful printing, surrounded by colorful drawings of people and hearts. "It's perfect," Marcus told her seriously. "The best award he's ever received." As Sophie grinned and threw her arms around Ranger's neck, Marcus caught David's eye over the child's head. The shared look contained a world of understanding, the terrifying knowledge of how close they had both come to irrevocable loss, and the profound gratitude for second chances. Later that evening, as the training fields emptied and the autumn light faded to dusk, Marcus took Ranger for their daily walk along the ridge overlooking Millfield. The lab moved more slowly these days, his muzzle graying and his joints beginning to stiffen, but his eyes remained bright and alert, constantly scanning their surroundings as if still on duty. They reached the overlook just as the setting sun bathed the small town in golden light. From this vantage point, Marcus could see it all, the repurposed barn that had become the Academy's headquarters, his mother's house where Richard now worked from a home office instead of pushing himself at the law firm. The church where a would-be funeral had transformed into a miracle, and the winding trails of Ridgeline where a lost child had been found. A landscape of second chances, of paths not taken and then suddenly, unexpectedly found. "Not bad for a retired team," Marcus told Ranger, sitting on a boulder and allowing the dog to settle against his leg. "Not bad at all." Ranger looked up at him with eyes that had seen both tragedy and triumph, that had peered through avalanches and into coffins, that had guided them both home when all other paths seemed lost. In that quiet moment, as darkness gathered and lights began to twinkle in the valley below, Marcus understood that the greatest rescue Ranger had ever performed wasn't finding Richard in that coffin or Sophie on that mountain. It was finding Marcus himself, not just beneath the snow of that long-ago avalanche, but every day since, showing him the way back to purpose, to family, to the person he was meant to be. And that, perhaps, was the most miraculous second chance of all. Marcus's fingers trembled as he dialed 911, his mind racing to process the impossible scene before him. Around him, the church had transformed from a place of somber mourning to chaotic disbelief. Some guests stood frozen in shock, others crowded forward trying to glimpse the miracle, while still others backed away as if witnessing something that defied the natural order of life and death itself. "Stay back, please," Father Thomas urged, his clerical authority cutting through the pandemonium. "Give him air." The funeral director, a man who had overseen hundreds of services with unflappable composure, now paced in agitated circles, repeating, "This is unprecedented, completely unprecedented," as if trying to convince himself that his professional reputation hadn't just been shattered beyond repair. Through it all, Ranger remained steady at Marcus's side, his mission accomplished, his alert stance relaxed, now into the quiet vigilance of a guardian who had done his duty. His intelligent eyes followed the movements around the coffin, occasionally glancing up at Marcus, as if to confirm that the humans were finally taking appropriate action. "The ambulance is 8 minutes out," Marcus reported, lowering his phone. His mother had pushed through the crowd to stand beside Richard's coffin, her tear-streaked face transformed by a hope so fragile it seemed almost cruel. "How is this possible?" Eleanor whispered, her hand hovering inches above her husband's face, afraid to touch him, as if he might vanish under her fingers. The doctor pronounced him The coroner confirmed. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, but his mind was already shifting into the familiar focused state that had guided him through countless rescue operations in the mountains. "But we need to make sure he keeps breathing until the paramedics arrive." Marcus's search and rescue training took over. He quickly assessed Richard's condition: the shallow breathing, the faint pulse visible in the neck, the ashen skin, tone that suggested hypoxia, but not yet cyanosis. Whatever had happened, whatever inexplicable physiological state had mimicked death so convincingly that medical professionals had been fooled, Richard was now in a precarious position between life and death. "Rebecca," Marcus called to his sister, who stood shell-shocked nearby, "find Dr. Abernathy. I know she attends this church." While Rebecca hurried off, Marcus turned to the funeral director. "Did you embalm him?" he asked bluntly, knowing the answer would determine Richard's chances of survival. The man shook his head, looking slightly ill. "No, the family requested a closed casket service promptly after death, with embalming scheduled for afterward, before interment tomorrow." Marcus felt a flood of relief. If Richard had been embalmed, there would have been no chance of survival. It seemed the very decisions that Eleanor had made in her grief, choices that Marcus had privately questioned as rushing through the process, had inadvertently given Richard this impossible second chance. Dr. Abernathy, a retired emergency physician in her 60s, pushed through the crowd with Rebecca close behind. Her holiday dress contrasted sharply with her clinical demeanor as she took charge of the situation. "Everyone except immediate family, please move back," she commanded, leaning into the coffin to check Richard's vital signs herself. After a tense moment, she looked up at Marcus and Eleanor with cautious professionalism. "He's definitely alive, but his condition is extremely critical. Pulse is threadly, respiration shallow and irregular. This man needs a hospital immediately." "The ambulance is on its way," Marcus assured her. Dr. Abernathy nodded, already removing her silk scarf and folding it into a makeshift pillow to better position Richard's airway. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted quietly. "A Lazarus syndrome case, perhaps, but typically those occur minutes after failed resuscitation attempts, not days later." Eleanor clutched Marcus's arm. Can he? She couldn't form the question that hung between them. Could Richard survive this impossible resurrection, or was this merely a crueler form of goodbye, a brief flicker of hope before the final darkness? Dr. Abernathy's face remained carefully neutral. Medicine has documented cases of people waking up in morgues. Though it's exceptionally rare, most involved misdiagnosis of conditions that can mimic death, certain drug overdoses, extreme hypothermia, catalepsy, or some neurological disorders. She glanced at Richard's ashen face. "The fact that he's breathing on his own is encouraging, but I won't speculate further until he's properly evaluated at the hospital." The wail of approaching sirens cut through the murmured prayers and speculation that filled the church. William, Richard's brother, stepped forward, his earlier anger replaced by a stunned disbelief. "I think," he said hoarsely, "this is going to be a very different kind of service than we anticipated." Father Thomas, who had been quietly praying over Richard, addressed the congregation. "Friends, we came here today to commend our brother, Richard, into God's hands, believing he had departed this life. It appears that the Lord has other plans." His voice strengthened with each word. I suggest we use this time to pray for his recovery, for the wisdom of the medical team who will care for him, and in gratitude for this miracle that has occurred among us." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the church, but Marcus noticed that many guests kept glancing not toward heaven, but at Ranger, who sat calmly at his feet, mission accomplished. Several people made the sign of the cross when looking at the dog, as if uncertain whether what they had witnessed was divine intervention or something more earthly, but no less extraordinary. The unfathomable connection between a well-trained dog and his handler. As the paramedics rushed in with their equipment and medical expertise, Marcus stepped back, gently guiding his mother aside to give them space to work. Ranger followed, staying close as he always did in crisis situations. "You knew," Marcus whispered to the dog, kneeling despite his aching leg to bring himself eye level with his companion. "How did you know when everyone else missed it?" Ranger simply gazed back at him with those intelligent eyes that had seen through avalanches, tracked lost hikers through impossible terrain, and now, somehow, had detected life where trained professionals had proclaimed death. The organized chaos of emergency medical response filled the church. The clipped medical terminology, the careful transfer of Richard from coffin to gurney, the swift attachment of monitoring equipment that immediately began reporting the vital signs of a man who until minutes ago had been prepared for burial. "We're taking him to Mercy General," the lead paramedic informed Eleanor. "You can follow in your vehicle." As Richard was wheeled out, the beeping of portable monitors replacing the hymns that should have filled the church, Eleanor turned to Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "If it hadn't been for Ranger," she whispered, unable to complete the thought. The horror of what nearly happened hung between them. Richard, alive but unconscious, sealed in a coffin, lowered into the ground, buried alive in the truest and most terrifying sense of the phrase. Marcus felt his legs weaken at the thought, and he leaned against a pew for support. Rebecca appeared at his side, her makeup streaked with tears of shock and hope. "Mom's riding with William to the hospital," she said. "We should follow." Marcus nodded, but as they turned to leave, they found their path blocked by a wall of people. Wedding guests who reached out to touch Ranger, to thank Marcus, to express their astonishment and gratitude at what they had witnessed. Father Thomas stood at the church door, speaking quietly with the funeral director, whose professional composure had completely crumbled into open weeping. "Come on," Marcus murmured to Rebecca, guiding her and Ranger toward a side exit to avoid the crowd. "We need to get to the hospital." The cool autumn air outside the church felt surreal after the intensity of what had transpired inside. Marcus helped Rebecca into his truck, then opened the back door for Ranger, who jumped in with practiced ease. As he slid behind the wheel, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face of a man who looked as if he'd witnessed something that had fundamentally shaken his understanding of the world. And perhaps he had, not because Richard had somehow survived whatever had caused his apparent death, but because once again, when it mattered most, when the difference between life and death hung in the balance, it was Ranger who had seen what humans had missed. The drive to Mercy General passed in a blur of sirens and traffic lights. Rebecca stared out the window, occasionally wiping fresh tears from her cheeks. "Do you remember," she said finally, breaking the stunned silence, "when Dad died? How Richard took over the funeral arrangements, handling everything so Mom wouldn't have to worry." Marcus nodded. It was one of his earliest positive memories of his stepfather, The quiet efficiency with which Richard had managed the painful logistics of death, while 10-year-old Marcus and his mother drowned in grief. He did everything perfectly, Rebecca continued. The funeral, the reception, the thank-you cards, even selling Dad's boat because Mom couldn't bear to see it in the driveway. She shook her head slowly. And now his own funeral. It's like a cosmic joke. Or a cosmic second. Unchance, Marcus suggested quietly. He's always been exceptional, Marcus said simply, feeling a surge of pride in his partner, even among working dogs. Dr. Patel made a note in her tablet. With your permission, I'd like to consult with some colleagues in veterinary medicine. About this case, there could be valuable research applications. Before Marcus could respond, a nurse appeared at the door. Dr. Patel, Mr. Harrington showing signs of increased brain activity. The anesthesiologist thinks he might be fighting the sedation. Dr. Patel excused herself quickly, promising to return with updates. The family was left in a strange limbo of hope and uncertainty, the adrenaline of the church drama beginning to fade into exhaustion. William left to make calls, cancelling the post-funeral reception that had been planned and notifying extended family of the extraordinary turn of events. Rebecca stepped out to find coffee, leaving Marcus and Eleanor alone with Ranger. I keep thinking, Eleanor said softly, still stroking Ranger's fur, about what would have happened if you hadn't brought him today. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. The alternative was too horrific to contemplate. I never really understood, she continued, why you chose that life in the mountains with your dogs, why you walked away from the law school scholarship Richard arranged, from the future he envisioned for you. She looked up, her eyes red, but clear. I thought you were running away from responsibility, from growing up. Richard thought so too. Marcus stiffened slightly. These were old wounds, scars from arguments that had driven him further from his family with each passing year. But today, Eleanor continued, watching you with Ranger in the church, seeing how you knew to trust him when everyone else thought he was just misbehaving, I finally understood. This wasn't a hobby or an escape. It was a calling. The simple acknowledgement after decades of misunderstanding left Marcus momentarily speechless. Before he could formulate a response, Rebecca returned with coffee cups and news. They're saying it's all over the local news already, she reported, handing out the steaming cups. Apparently, someone at the church took video after the ambulance arrived. They're calling it the Millfield miracle. Marcus groaned. Great. Just what Ranger needs, fame. But he knew the story was too extraordinary to remain private, especially in a small town like Millfield, where Richard was such a prominent figure. People are asking about you both, Rebecca continued, nodding, toward Marcus and Ranger. The reporter wants to interview the heroic dog and handler who prevented a living burial. Absolutely not, Marcus said firmly. Over his years in search and rescue, he'd developed a healthy aversion to publicity. The work itself, the lives saved, the families reunited, had always been reward enough without the uncomfortable spotlight of media attention. You might reconsider, William suggested, returning from his phone calls. This story is extraordinary, Marcus. A trained rescue dog detecting life in a man declared dead? The media will run with it with or without your participation. Before Marcus could respond, Dr. Patel returned, her expression cautiously optimistic. Mr. Harrington is showing increasing responsiveness, she reported. We've lightened his sedation slightly, and he's demonstrating purposeful movement. These are very encouraging signs." Eleanor clutched Rebecca's hand. "When can we see him?" "He's being moved to the ICU now. Once he's settled, you can visit briefly. 1 or 2 at a time," Dr. Patel explained. "He won't be fully conscious, but he may respond to your voices." As the family prepared to follow Dr. Patel to the ICU waiting area, Marcus hung back. "I'll wait here with Ranger," he offered. "He can't go into the ICU, and you should be with Richard first, Mom." Eleanor turned, surprising him. "No," she said firmly, "you should come too, both of you." When the doctor began to object about hospital policy regarding animals, Eleanor continued with uncharacteristic insistence. "That dog is the only reason my husband is alive instead of buried. I think we can bend the rules just this once." Dr. Patel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Briefly," she agreed, "and he'll need to remain at the threshold of the room, not approach the bed. Our ICU patients are extremely vulnerable to infection. They made their way through the hushed corridors of the hospital, an unusual procession of worried family members and one exceptionally well-behaved black Labrador who carried himself with the quiet dignity of a dog who knew his own worth. Hospital staff and visitors stopped to stare, some recognizing them from the already circulating news about the Millfield miracle. The ICU was a stark environment of beeping monitors and the hushed efficiency of life and death care. Richard lay in a private room, connected to an array of machines that monitored every aspect of his precarious hold on life. His face, which had been ashen in the coffin, now held a hint of color, though his eyes remained closed. Eleanor approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid her presence might somehow disrupt the delicate machinery keeping her husband alive. She gently took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "Richard," she said softly. "Richard, it's Eleanor. You're in the hospital. You're going to be all right." From the doorway where he stood with Ranger, Marcus watched his mother's gentle encouragement, her quiet strength in the face of circumstances that would have shattered many people. William and Rebecca joined her at the bedside, each adding their own words of support and astonishment. Marcus remained at the threshold, one hand resting on Ranger's head, content to observe from a distance. This had always been his position in the family, slightly apart, connected but separate, loving them deeply, but somehow never quite fitting into the life they had built after his father's death. But then Eleanor looked up, meeting his eyes across the room. "Marcus," she called, "come here. Bring Ranger to the doorway. Richard should know who saved him." Surprised, Marcus limped forward, Ranger keeping perfect heel position beside him. At the doorway he stopped as promised, ensuring the dog remained in the corridor. "Richard," Eleanor said, leaning close to her husband's ear, "Marcus and Ranger are here. Ranger knew you were alive, Richard. He saved you." Not to everyone's shock, Richard's eyelids fluttered. The hand that Eleanor held twitched slightly. "He hears you," Dr. Patel confirmed from where she monitored the situation. "This is a good sign." Eleanor looked toward Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Talk to him," she encouraged. "Let him hear your voice." Marcus hesitated. What could he possibly say to this man who had been his stepfather for 20 years, but had always remained a formal, slightly distant figure in his life? A man who had provided for him financially, but had never understood his choices or his passions. A man who, hours earlier, he had believed was dead. "Richard," he began awkwardly, "it's Marcus, and Ranger is here too." He paused, then added, "With simple honesty, he found you when no one else could, just like he found me in the avalanche 3 years ago." At the sound of Marcus's voice, Richard's monitors showed a subtle change. A slight increase in heart rate, a flicker of brain activity on the EEG. Dr. Patel watched with professional interest, making notes on her tablet. "The dog, Marcus," continued, gaining confidence. "Ranger, he knew something was wrong. He wouldn't stop barking at your coffin. He saved your life, Richard." As if understanding he was being discussed, Ranger let out a soft whine. At the sound, Richard's eyelids fluttered more pronouncedly, and his fingers twitched in Eleanor's grasp. "I think he hears the dog," Dr. Patel commented, moving closer to check Richard's pupils with a penlight. "This is fascinating. The auditory processing centers in his brain are showing increased activity." Eleanor stroked her husband's forehead. Gently, "You always said Marcus was wasting his talents with those rescue dogs," she said softly. "But without Ranger, we would have buried you alive, Richard. Think about that when you wake up properly." Dordine. The blunt truth of Eleanor's words hung in the air, a stark reminder of how close they had come to an unimaginable tragedy. Rebecca made a small sound of distress, while William paled noticeably. But Marcus found himself unexpectedly moved by his mother's straightforward acknowledgement of the reality they faced, and of the value of the work he and Ranger had dedicated their lives to. "I think that's enough for now," Dr. Patel suggested gently. "Mr. Harrington needs rest, and these are promising signs, but recovery will take time." As they prepared to leave, Richard's monitors suddenly registered a spike in activity. His eyelids fluttered open briefly, unfocused but undeniably conscious, before closing again. "Richard?" Eleanor gasped. "This is very encouraging," Dr. Patel confirmed. "But please, let's give him some space now. You can return in a few hours." In the ICU waiting room, the family sat in stunned silence, processing the roller coaster of emotions they had experienced in a single day, from grief to shock to tentative hope. Ranger settled at Marcus's feet, apparently untroubled by the extraordinary role he had played in the day's events. To him, it had simply been another workday, another human found, another mission accomplished. "I keep thinking," Rebecca said, finally breaking the silence, "about that line from Richard's eulogy that Father Thomas never got to deliver, about how he inspired everyone around him to reach higher." She gave a slightly hysterical laugh. "I guess he's still doing that, just not in the way any of us expected. Life rarely follows the script we write for it," Marcus observed quietly, thinking of his own journey from ambitious law school candidate to avalanche survivor to retired rescue handler. Sometimes the detours become the main road. William, who had been staring at his phone as messages poured in from business associates and friends who had heard the news, looked up with an odd expression. "Did you know," he said to no one in particular, "that Richard donated to a K-9 officer?" "Did you know," William said to no one in particular, "that Richard donated to a K-9 officer memorial fund last year, after that police dog was killed in the line of duty over in Lakeside County?" Marcus looked up startled. "No, I had no idea." "He never mentioned it," William continued, scrolling through his phone. "I only know because I was helping him organize his charitable giving records for tax purposes. He made a substantial donation, actually." Eleanor seemed equally surprised. "He never told me either." A nurse appeared in the doorway, interrupting their conversation. "Mrs. Harrington, your husband is showing more signs of consciousness. The doctor thought you might want to be present." Eleanor rose immediately, but instead of hurrying away, she turned to Marcus. "Would you come with me? You and Ranger?" Surprised by the request, Marcus nodded, struggling to his feet. His damaged leg, which had carried him through the extraordinary events of the day, was finally protesting the strain. Ranger noticed his discomfort immediately, pressing closer to offer support as they followed Eleanor and the nurse back to the ICU. Richard's room was now filled with additional medical staff, all monitoring the apparent miracle occurring before them. Richard's eyes were open, unfocused, but undeniably conscious. A respiratory therapist stood nearby, ready to assist if needed, while Dr. Patel checked his neurological responses with practiced efficiency. "Richard," Eleanor said, moving to his bedside and taking his hand. "Richard, can you hear me?" His eyes slowly tracked toward her voice, recognition dawning in their depths. He tried to speak, but couldn't around the breathing tube that had been inserted as a precaution. "Don't try to talk," Dr. Patel instructed. "Just blink once for yes, twice for no. Do you know where you are?" Richard blinked once, slowly but deliberately. "Do you remember what happened?" 2 blinks. "No." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "You were?" "We thought you had died, Richard. The doctor said it was a reaction to your new sleeping pills combined with your heart medication. You weren't dead, but in some kind of deep state that mimicked death." Richard's eyes widened in alarm, his heart monitor registering his distress. "You're safe now," Dr. Patel assured him quickly. "You're receiving excellent care, and all your vital signs are improving." Eleanor glanced back at Marcus, who stood at the doorway with Ranger sitting alertly at his side. "Richard, there's someone you should see, someone who saved your life today." At her gesture, Marcus limped forward until he and Ranger were visible from Richard's bed. The dog's ears perked forward with interest, his intelligent eyes fixed on the man in the hospital bed. "Ranger knew you were alive," Eleanor explained. "At the funeral, he wouldn't stop barking at your coffin. He knew something everyone else had missed." Richard's gaze shifted to the black Labrador, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Slowly, with obvious effort, he lifted his free hand a few inches off the bed, a clear gesture toward the dog. "I think he wants Ranger closer," Eleanor said, looking questioningly at Dr. Patel. The doctor hesitated, hospital protocol warring with the extraordinary circumstances. "Briefly," she conceded, "and the dog must be kept away from any medical equipment." Marcus led Ranger carefully into the room, ensuring the lab didn't disturb any of the vital monitoring equipment surrounding Richard's bed. "Ranger, gentle," he instructed quietly, though the command was hardly necessary. The dog moved with the careful precision that had made him exceptional at working around injured victims in the wilderness. At the bedside, Ranger sat perfectly, his nose level with Richard's outstretched hand. With trembling fingers, Richard managed to touch the dog's head in a weak approximation of a pat. His eyes, still cloudy with medication, but undeniably aware, held the dog's gaze in what seemed like a moment of profound connection. Dr. Patel watched with clinical interest. "This is remarkable," she murmured. "His neural responses are strengthening. The emotional connection appears to be stimulating increased brain activity." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. "All these years," she said softly, and it took nearly dying for these two to finally connect. Richard's eyes moved from Ranger to Marcus, a question evident in their depths even without words. "He found me too," Marcus said quietly, understanding the unspoken query. "When I was buried in that avalanche 3 years ago, the search teams had given up, but Ranger wouldn't stop looking. He dug through 6 feet of snow to reach me." Richard blinked once. Yes, he remembered hearing about the accident, though Marcus had never shared the full details with his family. "That's what search and rescue dogs do," Marcus continued. "They find people everyone else has given up on. They see possibility where others see only impossibility." Richard's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion besides confusion he'd displayed since waking. His fingers curled weakly in Ranger's fur, and the dog responded by leaning slightly into the touch, offering the simple comfort that had guided countless rescued victims through their darkest moments. "I think that's enough for now," Dr. Patel said gently. "Mr. Harrington needs rest, and these have been significant exertions for someone in his condition." Marcus agreed, secretly relieved to have a moment to process the unexpected emotional openness Richard had displayed. As he and Ranger made their way down the hospital corridor, staff members stopped to greet the dog, who had become something of a celebrity overnight. Even patients who had heard the story leaned out of their rooms to catch a glimpse of the miracle dog who had detected life where medical science had proclaimed death. In the hospital garden, a small landscaped area designed to provide respite for patients and families, Marcus found a quiet bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. Ranger settled at his feet, content in the dappled sunlight and fresh air after the antiseptic environment of the hospital. Marcus's mind turned over the conversations of the past 24 hours. Eleanor's new respect for his career choices, Dave's suggestion about channeling Ranger's fame into a new training program, Dr. Patel's interest in medical detection applications, and now Richard's startling emotional transparency. For 15 years, his path had been clear. Find the lost, rescue the stranded, save lives in the wilderness with Ranger as his partner. When the avalanche ended that chapter, he'd felt adrift, purposeless, defined more by what he could know, longer due than by new possibilities. But now, as he watched Ranger basking in the simple pleasure of sunlight and interesting garden scents, Marcus began to see the outlines of a new path forming. Not a replacement for what was lost, but an evolution of the work he and Ranger had always done together. Finding people didn't have to mean searching through snow or forests. Sometimes the lost were right in front of everyone, hidden in plain sight, like Richard in that coffin. Sometimes the rescue needed wasn't from physical danger, but from mist, connections, misunderstandings, or the rigid thinking that had kept him and his stepfather at arm's length for decades. And sometimes, the most important discoveries happened not on remote mountainsides, but in hospital rooms and family conversations where truth finally found voice after years of silence. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, alert to something Marcus couldn't detect. Following the dog's gaze, Marcus spotted William approaching through the garden path, his usual corporate polish somewhat rumpled after the extraordinary events of the past day. "Marcus," William greeted him, settling onto the bench with uncharacteristic weariness. "Eleanor said I might find you out here." He reached down to pat Ranger, the gesture awkward but genuine. "How's the hero of the hour?" "Unfazed," Marcus replied with a small smile. To Ranger, yesterday was just another successful finding. The context doesn't matter much to him. William nodded thoughtfully. That's the difference between dogs and humans, isn't it? They do extraordinary things, without requiring recognition or explanation. They just do what needs doing. That's what makes them such perfect rescue partners, Marcus agreed. No ego, no hesitation, just absolute focus on the mission. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, an unusual experience with the typically talkative William, who had always filled conversational gaps with business anecdotes and market analyses during family gatherings. "I've been thinking," William said finally, "about Richard's foundation." Marcus raised an eyebrow questioningly. He knew Richard had established a charitable foundation years ago, focused primarily on legal aid and educational scholarships, but had never been particularly involved with its operations. "The Harrington Foundation has considerable resources," William continued, "as chairman of the board during Richard's absence. I had begun reviewing potential new initiatives for the coming year." He paused. "In light of recent events, I think a shift in focus might be appropriate." Marcus waited, sensing there was more coming, but unwilling to rush his brother-in-law's uncharacteristically thoughtful mood. "What would you think," William asked carefully, "about the Foundation funding a comprehensive canine training center here, in Millfield? Not just for search and rescue, but for medical detection, therapy work, all the ways dogs like Ranger can save lives and improve them." The proposal was so closely aligned with Marcus's own emerging thoughts that he was momentarily speechless. "I'm not talking about a small pilot program," William clarified, perhaps misinterpreting Marcus's silence as hesitation. "I'm proposing a major initiative with significant funding, state-of-the-art facilities, and scientific research partnerships. Something that could become a national model." "Why?" Marcus asked finally, finding his voice. "Why would you suggest this now?" William looked down at Ranger, who had shifted to press against Marcus's leg in his typical supportive gesture. "Because yesterday I watched a dog detect life where the most advanced medical technology and trained professionals saw only death. That's not just extraordinary, it's revolutionary." He straightened, some of his business dynamism returning. And revolutions need infrastructure, funding, and vision to achieve their full potential. The scope of what William was suggesting began to take shape in Marcus's mind, not just a training program or a research project, but a comprehensive center that could transform the understanding and application of canine capabilities across multiple fields. "It would need expert leadership," William continued, his gaze steady on Marcus's face. "Someone who understands both the practical aspects of working with detection dogs and the unique bond between handler and animal that makes such extraordinary performances possible." The implied offer hung in the air between them, as unexpected as it was intriguing. Marcus had never seen himself as an administrator or institution builder. His expertise had always been in the field, in practical application rather than program development. "I'm not qualified to run something like that," he objected. "My experience is hands-on, not organizational." "That's exactly why it would work," William countered. "This can't be just another well-intentioned charity project run by business people who've never worked with a dog more complicated than a lapdog. It needs someone who has lived the reality, who understands what's at stake when a dog like Ranger picks up a scent that no one else can detect." Ranger's ears perked up at the sound of his name, his attention shifting between the two men as if following the conversation. Think about it, William urged, rising from the bench. Talk to Richard when he's stronger. This could be his legacy, and yours and Ranger's too. He glanced toward the hospital building. I should get back. The doctors wanted to discuss Richard's release planning. As William walked away, Marcus remained on the bench, his mind churning with possibilities that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Before yesterday, he had been a retired search and rescue handler with a damaged leg and an aging dog, trying to find purpose in a life that no longer fit his expectations. Now, he sat in a hospital garden, contemplating a future where his and Ranger's experience could shape a new generation of life-saving dogs and handlers, a future where the extraordinary bond they shared might become a model for understanding the untapped potential of canine perception in a wide range of applications. Ranger shifted, resting his head on Marcus's knee and gazing up with those intelligent eyes that had seen through avalanches, tracked lost hikers through impossible terrain, and somehow detected life in a man declared dead by modern medicine. "What do you think, partner?" Marcus asked softly. "Ready for one more mission? The biggest one yet?" Ranger's tail thumped against the garden path. Once, twice, 3 times. Not an answer, of course. Just a dog expressing contentment in his handler's company. But to Marcus, who had learned to read this dog's subtlest communications over 15 years of partnership, it felt remarkably like agreement. 3 weeks after the Millfield miracle, as local news had dubbed it, Richard sat in a wheelchair on the back porch of his and Eleanor's Victorian home, watching the autumn leaves dance across the manicured lawn. Though still weak, his recovery had progressed remarkably well, allowing his release from the hospital just days earlier. His complexion had improved from deathly pallor to merely pale, and the fog of medication had cleared from his eyes, revealing a sharpness and awareness that surprised even those who had known him for decades. Ranger lay at his feet, the black lab having appointed himself Richard's unofficial guardian since their return home. The dog, who had once maintained a respectful distance from Marcus's stepfather, now shadowed him throughout the day, seemingly aware that his mission to save this particular human wasn't yet complete. Puzzled, Marcus unfolded what appeared to be an official letter. As he read, his eyebrows rose in surprise. "They're revising emergency medical protocols for death confirmation?" he asked, scanning the dense technical language. "Based on your case?" Richard nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. The guidelines now specify that in cases where cadaver detecting or search and rescue dogs are available, they should be utilized as a secondary confirmation method before death. Is officially pronounced in ambiguous situations. The implication was enormous. A major medical governing body had formally acknowledged the superior detection capabilities of trained dogs, incorporating them into official protocols that could affect thousands of future cases. "This is just the beginning," Richard said quietly. "One small change in one state's procedures, but it represents a crack in the armor of institutional resistance to acknowledging what dogs like Ranger can perceive that our technology misses." Marcus refolded the letter thoughtfully, and the center would build on this momentum. "Exactly." Richard gestured toward the blueprints. "Not just training more dogs, but systematically documenting their capabilities, building the evidence base that drives policy changes, creating protocols that integrate canine detection into systems that currently rely exclusively on technology and human perception." The vision was compelling, not just a training facility or research center, but a catalyst for transformation across multiple systems. Marcus thought of Zoe at the shelter, of the countless other dogs with exceptional potential but no pathway to utilize it. He thought of Richard in that coffin, alive but undetected by conventional medical examinations. Most of all, he thought of Ranger, one extraordinary dog whose perception had not only saved a life, but potentially changed medical protocols that could affect countless future cases. "I need to sleep on this," Marcus said finally. "It's a bigger decision than I can make in an afternoon." "Of course," Richard agreed, "but don't sleep too long." A shadow of his old dry humor surfaced. "I've already had one funeral interrupted. I'd prefer not to have another before seeing this project launched." As they left the study together, Ranger leading the way with the confident purposefulness that had characterized his entire working life, Marcus felt the outlines of a new path taking shape before him. Not a replacement for the career the Avalanche had ended prematurely, but an evolution of it, a way to extend the impact of his and Ranger's partnership beyond what either could have accomplished alone. Outside, the autumn sunset painted Millfield in shades of gold and amber. The church steeple, where their extraordinary journey had begun 3 weeks earlier, gleaming in the fading light. In that moment, standing on the porch with Ranger at his side and the architectural plans for a revolutionary center fresh in his mind, Marcus understood what Richard had been trying to articulate earlier. A second chance wasn't about correcting past mistakes or reclaiming what was lost. It was about recognizing new possibilities that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment, and sometimes the right dog, to reveal them. 1 year later, Ranger sat alert beside Marcus on the stage of the newly completed Millfield Canine Detection and Research Center. The black lab's muzzle showed more grey than when he'd barked at Richard's coffin, but his eyes remained clear and focused as he surveyed the crowd gathered for the grand opening ceremony. At 10 years old, he carried himself with the dignified confidence of a dog who had saved countless lives and transformed countless more through his extraordinary legacy. Marcus adjusted the microphone, fighting the lingering nervousness that public speaking still triggered despite a year of media interviews, fundraising presentations, and training seminars. The auditorium before him was filled to capacity. Local community members, representatives from medical and emergency response organizations, potential research partners, and most significantly, handlers with their working dogs seated attentively throughout the audience. 1 year ago, Marcus began, his voice steadying as he found his rhythm, many of you witnessed or heard about an extraordinary event at St. Peter's Church. A funeral service interrupted by a dog who detected what medical science had missed. Life in a man declared dead. A murmur rippled through the audience. Though the story had been told countless times in news reports and medical journals, it still carried the power to astonish. What Ranger did that day wasn't magic, Marcus continued, resting his hand on the lab's head. It wasn't a miracle in the supernatural sense. It was something both simpler and more profound, an example of perception that extends beyond human capability, detection that surpasses our most advanced technology. In the front row, Richard sat with Eleanor and Rebecca, his health fully restored and his eyes bright with pride, as he watched his stepson address the gathering. The attorney, who had once dismissed Marcus's career as frivolous, now leaned forward intently, hanging on every word. Today we open not just a training facility or research center, Marcus explained, gesturing to the expansive campus visible through the auditorium's windows. We're launching a new understanding of what's possible when we recognize, develop, and integrate canine capabilities into our human systems. The journey to this moment had been extraordinary. What began as a tentative conversation on Richard's porch had evolved into a comprehensive vision that attracted support far beyond Marcus's most optimistic projections. The Henderson farm property had been transformed into a state-of-the-art campus with specialized training facilities, research laboratories, and residential quarters for both handlers and dogs. Our work here will follow 4 interconnected paths, Marcus outlined, settling into the presentation he'd refined through months of development meetings. First, advancing scientific understanding of canine detection capabilities through rigorous research partnerships with medical and technological institutions. He gestured toward the research wing, where laboratories equipped with specialized scent analysis equipment awaited the arrival of research scientists and their canine collaborators. Second, developing standardized protocols for integrating canine detection into systems that currently rely exclusively on technology and human perception, medical diagnostics, emergency response procedures, search methodologies. In the audience, several physicians nodded their agreement. The past year had seen multiple medical institutions revising their protocols based on the implications of Richard's case, with several pilot programs now incorporating specially trained detection dogs into diagnostic processes for certain conditions. Third, creating a pipeline that identifies and trains promising shelter dogs for specialized work, expanding opportunities for both the dogs and the people who need their capabilities. This component had become Marcus's particular passion. In the months of development, the Shelter-to-Service program had quickly emerged as one of the center's most distinctive and potentially transformative initiatives. And finally, training handlers not just in technical skills, but in the fundamental understanding that underlies the human-canine partnership, the recognition that our dogs sometimes perceive what we cannot, and that humility in the face of their capabilities is as important as expertise in directing them. As Marcus continued outlining the center's vision and programs, he caught sight of familiar faces throughout the audience. Dave Matthews, his former search and rescue captain, sat with several colleagues from the mountain rescue team. Sarah from the local shelter beamed proudly, having recently joined the center's staff to coordinate the shelter dog assessment program. Dr. Patel from the hospital had become a key advisor on the medical detection research initiatives, and perhaps most significantly, seated in the second row, with a black bandana around her neck, identifying her as a center trainee, was Zoe, the border collie mix from the shelter, who had become the first success story of the Shelter-to-Service pipeline. Now in training as a seizure-alert dog, she represented exactly the potential Marcus had envisioned, capabilities that might have gone untapped now being developed to change lives. We stand at the beginning of a journey, Marcus concluded. His formal remarks, not just for this center, but for a fundamental shift in how we understand and utilize the extraordinary partnership humans and dogs have built over thousands of years of evolution. He turned slightly to acknowledge Ranger beside him. None of this would exist without one dog's perception exceeding human understanding at a critical moment. When Ranger barked at that coffin, he wasn't just saving one life. He was illuminating a path forward for countless others. The applause was enthusiastic but respectful of the working dogs present. As Marcus stepped back from the podium, Richard rose from his seat to take the stage for the official ribbon cutting. The attorney moved with the vigor of a man who had indeed received a second chance and was determined to make the most of it. As the primary funder of this initiative, Richard began, his courtroom voice carrying easily through the auditorium, I'm often asked what motivated such a significant investment in canine research and training. He paused, his gaze finding Marcus and Ranger at the side of the stage. The answer is simple. I experienced firsthand the consequences of underestimating what these animals can perceive. That misperception nearly cost me my life. But more importantly, it revealed how many other lives might be lost or diminished when we failed to recognize capabilities that exist right beside us. Richard's public speaking skills had been honed through decades in courtrooms and boardrooms, but there was a new quality to his delivery now, a passionate conviction that transcended professional polish. The Millfield Center represents more than a philanthropic project, he continued. It embodies a fundamental principle that extends far beyond working dogs, the recognition that perception takes many forms, that intelligence manifests in diverse ways, and that progress often requires us to look beyond our human-centric assumptions about capability. As Richard continued with the formal acknowledgments of donors, partners, and community supporters, Marcus felt Ranger shift slightly against his leg. The lab's attention had fixed on something in the audience, not with alarm, but with the focused interest that had characterized his working life. Following Ranger's gaze, Marcus spotted a young woman in a wheelchair near the back of the auditorium, a golden retriever service dog sitting alertly beside her. Though he didn't recognize her immediately, something about her seemed vaguely familiar. The mystery was solved moments later when Richard diverged from his prepared remarks. I'd like to acknowledge a special guest joining us today, he said, gesturing toward the young woman Marcus had noticed. Sophie Corman and her service dog Beacon. A ripple of recognition passed through those familiar with the local community. Marcus suddenly placed her, the 7-year-old girl who had been lost on Ridgeline Trail the day of Richard's funeral. Now a teenager, she sat with quiet dignity as attention turned briefly her way. Many of you know that on the same day Ranger detected life in my coffin, he and Marcus went on to find young Sophie lost in dangerous terrain during a gathering storm, Richard explained. What you may not know is that experience inspired Sophie's family to become advocates for service dog accessibility after she was later diagnosed with a neurological condition. Sophie smiled shyly, her hand resting on her golden retriever's head, in the intuitive connection that characterized effective service dog partnerships. Beacon came from our very first training cohort, Richard continued with evident pride. A shelter dog selected for his exceptional sensitivity, now providing crucial medical alerts and mobility support that allow Sophie to navigate her world with independence. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, the first full-circle moment of the center's mission, connecting back to the extraordinary day that had launched this journey. As Richard concluded his remarks and ceremonially cut the ribbon spanning the auditorium stage, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. The path from that interrupted funeral to this moment had been neither straight nor simple, requiring him to evolve from field handler to program developer, from rescue specialist to institution builder. The transition hadn't been without challenges. There had been moments of doubt when the scope of the project seemed overwhelming, when bureaucratic obstacles threatened timelines, when old habits of independent fieldwork clashed with the collaborative requirements of building something larger than himself. But through it all, Ranger had remained his steady center, the embodiment of the mission, the living proof of what was possible when canine capabilities were fully recognized and developed. The formal ceremony concluded with tours of the new facilities. Marcus found himself leading a group of medical professionals through the specialized training areas, explaining how the scent detection protocols were structured and how research findings would be incorporated into evolving training methodologies. The key innovation isn't just the training techniques, he explained, as they observed a demonstration of medical detection work. It's the integrated approach that connects research directly to application, creating a continuous feedback loop between scientific discovery and practical implementation. Dr. Patel, who had joined the tour group, nodded her agreement. What we're seeing is the emergence of a new field at the intersection of multiple disciplines, not just animal behavior and human medicine, but neuroscience, biochemistry, even artificial intelligence. How so? Asked another physician, watching with fascination as a young Labrador successfully identified the sample containing cancer cells from among 12 identical-appearing containers. We're not trying to replace technology with dogs, Marcus clarified. We're using each to enhance the other. The patterns that dogs detect help researchers focus their technological development, while technology helps us understand and quantify what the dogs are perceiving. As the tour continued through the research wing, Marcus noticed Richard had fallen into conversation with William near the main entrance. The brothers-in-law had become unlikely partners in the center's development, Richard providing the vision and funding, while William applied his business acumen to the practical aspects of establishing a sustainable operation. "Marcus," Richard called, motioning him over when the tour concluded. "There's someone here I think you should meet." Beside the two men stood a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s, her silver hair cut in a practical bob and her posture suggesting military background despite her civilian clothing. Dr. Margaret Whelan, Richard introduced her, director of the National Institute for Integrated Detection Systems. She's expressed particular interest in our shelter-to-service pipeline. Marcus recognized the name immediately. Dr. Whelan was a legendary figure in working dog circles, having pioneered several groundbreaking programs that expanded the role of detection dogs in everything from disaster response to medical diagnosis. Your center represents exactly the kind of integrated approach we've been advocating for at the federal level, Dr. Whelan said, dispensing with pleasantries in favor of direct engagement. Particularly your shelter dog program. The data you're gathering could help us address the critical shortage of specialized detection dogs nationwide. The conversation that followed pulled Marcus deep into the technical aspects of the center's assessment protocols and training methodologies. Dr. Whelan asked pointed questions about selection criteria, success rates, and validation measures. Not from skepticism, but from genuine professional interest. We've been arguing for years that purpose-bred puppies aren't the only viable source for high-level detection work, she explained as they walked toward the shelter dog training area. But we've lacked the systematic data to challenge institutional resistance. Your program is generating exactly the evidence base we need. The implications of national-level interest exceeded Marcus's expectations for the center's first year. What had begun as a local initiative inspired by one extraordinary incident was already expanding towards systemic impact across multiple institutions. As the day's events wound down and the last visitors departed, Marcus found himself back in the main training yard with Ranger, watching the sunset paint the new buildings in gold and amber. The black lab settled contentedly at his feet, seemingly satisfied with the day's accomplishments. "Quite a journey from that church, huh, partner?" Marcus murmured, scratching behind Ranger's ears in the spot that had always been his favorite. Ranger's tail thumped against the ground in contented agreement. At 10, he was officially retired from active search work, but his role had evolved rather than diminished. As the center's canine ambassador and living embodiment of its founding purpose, he continued changing lives in ways neither of them could have imagined during their mountain rescue days. "I thought I'd find you two out here," Richard's voice came from behind them. "Some habits never change." Marcus turned to find his stepfather approaching across the training yard, moving with the measured pace of a man who no longer took mobility for granted. "Just taking it all in," Marcus admitted. "Sometimes I still can't quite believe we built all this in a year." Richard settled onto a nearby bench, gesturing for Marcus to join him. "It's remarkable what becomes possible when the right idea meets the right moment and the right people to implement it." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the last light fade from the western sky. So much had changed between them since that interrupted funeral, the formal politeness of their previous relationship replaced by genuine partnership and growing mutual respect. "The medical board called today," Richard said finally. "They've officially adopted the expanded death confirmation protocols we proposed, including mandatory secondary verification in ambiguous cases." The news represented a significant victory for one of the center's core advocacy initiatives. For months, they had been working with medical authorities to formalize the lessons learned from Richard's case into standardized protocols that could prevent similar near tragedies. "That's the 7th state to adopt the new standards," Marcus noted with satisfaction. "The momentum is building." Richard nodded. "And the research data from our medical detection program is strengthening the case further. When people see the statistical comparison between conventional testing and canine detection rates for certain conditions." He shook his head in continued amazement. "The numbers speak for themselves." Ranger shifted to press against Marcus's leg, his steady warmth a familiar comfort as evening coolness settled over the training yard. The gesture carried a lifetime of communication between handler and dog, silent support that had sustained them through avalanches, wilderness searches, and now the challenges of building something larger than themselves. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Richard said, his tone suggesting he'd been considering the topic carefully. "Phase 2 of the center's development." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "We've barely completed Phase 1. "True," Richard acknowledged with a hint of his old dry humor, "but near-death experiences tend to accelerate one's timeline. Why wait for tomorrow what might matter today?" The philosophical shift still surprised Marcus occasionally, this contemplative, almost urgent quality that had replaced Richard's former methodical caution. The attorney who had once planned everything with meticulous 5-year projections now spoke of legacy and impact with the intensity of someone who understood time's fragility firsthand. "What are you envisioning?" Marcus asked. Richard's eyes lit with the enthusiasm that now characterized his approach to the center's work. International partnerships, specialized training programs for underserved regions where detection dogs could address critical needs, landmine detection, disease surveillance in remote areas, early warning systems for natural disasters. The scope was breathtaking, yet somehow consistent with the trajectory they had established. What had begun with one dog barking at one coffin had already expanded beyond anyone's initial vision. Why not further? "That's ambitious," Marcus said carefully. "Life is too short for anything less," Richard replied without hesitation. "I learned that in the most literal way possible." He paused, then continued more personally. "You know, I spent decades measuring success by courtroom victories and billing hours. I thought I was building something meaningful." He gestured toward the center's buildings silhouetted against the darkening sky. "But this changes lives in ways my legal career never could. Not just human lives, but the thousands of dogs who might otherwise never have the chance to use their extraordinary capabilities." Marcus understood. His own definition of purpose had evolved similarly over the past year. Search and rescue work had always provided clear, immediate impact, specific lives saved in specific moments of crisis. The center's work offered something different, systemic transformation that would ripple outward for generations, changing how human and canine capabilities intertwined to address some of humanity's most pressing challenges. "We should bring William into the Phase 2 planning," Marcus suggested, already mentally outlining the infrastructure such expansion would require. "And Dr. Whelan, her international connections would be invaluable." Richard nodded approvingly. "I've already scheduled a preliminary discussion for next week. Eleanor suggested inviting Sophie and her family as well. Their perspective as service dog recipients has been remarkably insightful for program refinements." As they continued discussing possibilities, Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears perked toward the main building. Seconds later, Marcus heard what the dog had already detected: approaching footsteps on the gravel path. Rebecca appeared, flashlight in hand. "There you are. Mom sent me to find you. She says if you two don't come in for dinner, she's donating it all to the Handler dormitory." She grinned. "And she made your favorite pot roast, Marcus, so I wouldn't test her." "Heaven forbid we miss Eleanor's pot roast," Richard said with mock seriousness, leveraging himself up from the bench. "Some threats cannot be ignored, no matter how visionary the planning session." As they walked back toward the main building, Rebecca fell into step beside Marcus. "The CNN producer called again," she informed him. "They're still hoping you'll reconsider the feature story offer." Marcus shook his head. Media interest in the center had been constant since its inception, with regular requests for interviews and documentary access. While he recognized the value of public awareness for their work, he maintained his lifelong aversion to personal publicity. "The work speaks for itself," he said simply. "They're welcome to cover the research findings and program outcomes without making it about personalities." Rebecca sighed with familiar exasperation. "You realize your media reluctance only makes them more persistent. Nothing intrigues journalists like someone who doesn't want attention." "Let them be intrigued from a distance," Marcus replied good-naturedly. "Richard handles the public relations side much better anyway." This division of responsibilities had evolved naturally over the past year, with Richard's courtroom-honed communication skills making him the center's natural spokesperson, while Marcus focused on program development and training standards. The arrangement suited them both, Richard energized by the opportunity to advocate for their vision, Marcus free to build the substance behind the public narrative. As they approached the main building, now illuminated against the night sky, Marcus was struck by how quickly this place had come to feel like home. The training yards and research facilities aligned with his handler's instincts in ways the corporate world never could have, while the administrative aspects that might once have seemed burdensome now felt like natural extensions of the mission he and Ranger had always served. Inside, Eleanor had set dinner in the center's conference room, transforming the utilitarian space with tablecloth and proper dishes. Her subtle insistence that regardless of workload, civilized meals remained important. The aroma of pot roast and fresh bread filled the room, drawing appreciative sniffs from Ranger as he settled in his customary spot near Marcus's chair. "I was about to send out a search party," Eleanor teased as they entered. "Though I suppose with Ranger, you qualify as one by default." The easy humor reflected how thoroughly she had embraced the center's work over the past year. Once merely supportive of Marcus's career from maternal obligation, Eleanor had become a passionate advocate, particularly for the therapy dog program that served local hospitals and elder care facilities. As they settled around the table, the conversation flowed naturally through updates on various center initiatives, community feedback, and plans for the upcoming handler certification program. This had become their normal, family dinner seamlessly integrated with the work that now defined all their lives in different ways. "Sarah mentioned Zoe's training is ahead of schedule," Eleanor noted, serving Richard a modest portion in keeping with his post-recovery diet. "Her seizure-alert accuracy is apparently remarkable for this stage of development." Marcus nodded with pride. The Border Collie mix had exceeded even his optimistic projections, demonstrating exceptional sensitivity to pre-seizure biochemical changes. "She'll be ready for placement weeks earlier than anticipated. The family's already started orientation sessions. From shelter dog to life-saving service animal in less than a year," Richard mused. "Think of how many others like her might be overlooking in shelters nationwide." "That's exactly why the assessment protocols we're developing matter so much," Marcus agreed. "Standardized identification methods could transform both shelter outcomes and service dog availability simultaneously." As dinner continued, William arrived with latest financial projections, joining them seamlessly as the conversation shifted towards sustainable growth models for Phase 2 expansion. Eleanor's insistence on proper family meals had somehow evolved to include the center's core operations team, creating a uniquely effective blend of personal and professional collaboration. Later, as Marcus walked back to his cabin on the property, Edge with Ranger trotting contentedly beside him, he found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The path from interrupted funeral to International Detection Center could never have been predicted or planned. It had unfolded through a series of responses to what was revealed in each moment, guided by Ranger's extraordinary perception and the collective willingness to trust where it led. Inside the cabin, Marcus settled into his favorite chair, reviewing training data on his tablet while Ranger arranged himself on his orthopedic bed nearby. The lab's muzzle might be grayer, his pace slightly slower, but his eyes remained as bright and perceptive as the day he'd alerted to Richard's coffin, changing everything. "You know what today is, right, partner?" Marcus said quietly. Ranger's ears perked up at his voice, head tilting slightly in the gesture that had always melted. Marcus's heart. 1 year exactly since the funeral, since you changed everything. Of course, Ranger couldn't understand the anniversary's significance, couldn't conceptualize how his simple act of detection had catalyzed transformation far beyond one saved life. To him, barking at that coffin had been no different from finding a hiker buried in snow or a child lost in the wilderness, perception leading to action, unencumbered by doubt or institutional constraint. And perhaps therein lay the deepest lesson of their journey together. That extraordinary impact often began with simply trusting what was perceived, even when it contradicted established knowledge or conventional wisdom. Ranger hadn't questioned whether a man declared dead could somehow be alive. He had simply detected life and insisted others recognize it too. A text message illuminated Marcus's phone. Richard. Dinner was just the beginning. Wait until you see what Eleanor's planning for the actual anniversary celebration next week. Apparently, miracle resurrections deserve proper acknowledgement. Marcus smiled at his stepfather's newfound ability to joke about the experience that had nearly claimed his life. It represented yet another transformation in a year filled with them. The formal attorney who had once maintained rigid emotional control, now moving through the world with an openness and occasional whimsy that still surprised those who had known him before. Another message followed. Dr. Whelan called. The National Advisory Committee wants our shelter assessment protocols for consideration as federal standards. It's happening, Marcus. Faster than even I anticipated. The implications were enormous. Federal standardization would exponentially multiply the center's impact, potentially transforming shelter dog outcomes and service animal availability nationwide. What had begun as a local response to an extraordinary incident was becoming a systemic revolution in how human and canine capabilities intertwined to address critical needs. As Marcus set aside his phone and prepared for sleep, Ranger rose from his bed and padded over, resting his graying muzzle on Marcus's knee in a gesture that had sustained them both through countless challenges. The simple connection carried 15 years of partnership, mountains and avalanches, loss and recovery, purpose found and redefined. We did good, didn't we? Marcus murmured, stroking the lab's soft head. Not just saved a life, but built something that will save many more. Ranger's tail swept slowly across the cabin floor. Not an answer in human terms, but something perhaps more profound. The contented acknowledgement of a mission fulfilled not just for a moment, but in ways that would ripple outward long after. Both of them were gone. Outside the cabin window, the center's building stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, physical manifestation of a vision that had begun with one dog's extraordinary perception and the handler who trusted it even when everyone else saw only impossibility. In that quiet moment, with Ranger's steady presence beside him and the center's lights glowing in the distance, Marcus understood with perfect clarity what Richard had been struggling to articulate in his philosophical moments on the porch. A second chance wasn't just about survival or correction or even redemption. It was about revelation, seeing possibilities that had been present all along, but required extraordinary circumstances to become visible. It was about transformation, not just of circumstance, but of perception itself, allowing new pathways to emerge where none had seemed possible before. And perhaps most importantly, it was about trust. in connections that transcended conventional understanding, in capabilities that exceeded established limitations, in possibilities that emerged when old boundaries dissolved. 1 year after, the interrupted funeral that had changed everything, Marcus closed his eyes in profound gratitude, not just for the life Ranger had saved that day, but for the vision he had revealed. A vision of what became possible when humans recognized that their perception was just one way of understanding a world filled with extraordinary capabilities waiting to be discovered, developed, and deployed in service of needs greater than themselves. Ranger settled back into his bed with a contented sigh. Mission complete, legacy secured, partnership unbroken, even as it had evolved beyond anything either of them could have imagined when they first found each other 15 years earlier in the snow-capped mountains that had forged their bond. Outside, the stars continued their ancient patterns across the sky, bearing witness to the quiet miracle unfolding below. Not the supernatural wonder of resurrection, but the equally profound marvel of perception recognized, potential fulfilled, and purpose discovered in the bark of a dog who saw life where others had proclaimed only death. And in that recognition lay perhaps the greatest lesson of their extraordinary journey, that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from technological advancement or human innovation, but from simply learning to trust different ways of perceiving the world we share with other beings whose capabilities may exceed our own, in ways we are only beginning to understand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.